Okay. Oh, okay. Dear colleagues, I guess we need to start. I feel the responsibility that we are standing between you and the end of the day and possible dinner. So that's why let us start this session, which is last but devoted, I guess, to one of the hottest topics on Iran's relations, on Iran's relations with Russia. And I have a pleasure to introduce four speakers who are going to discuss this topic today. On my left hand, Professor Li-Chen Sim, who is an assistant professor at Khalifa University in the UAE and also a non-resident scholar at the US Middle East Institute. I guess we're in the same section of energy and economy there. On my right hand, I have a pleasure to have Dr. Abdolrasool Divsallar, who is a visiting professor at the, I'm sorry for my Italian, it's almost absent, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. I hope I managed to fit somehow. And also non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, focusing on defense and strategic studies. So he is in a slightly different section of the institute. And online, we have pleasure to have Dr. Eric Loeb, who is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. And also he will be accompanied by Mazaher Koruzhde, who is a lecturer of international relations at Howard University. So without further delay, let me ask Dr. Li-Chen Sim to open this session with a presentation on the Russian challenge to Iran's Look East policy. Dr. Li-Chen Sim, the floor is yours. Last but probably the most important, due to number of participants, we have 15 minutes sharp for each presentation. Please stick to that time limits. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I thought that I would look at the economic aspect of Russia's impact on Iran's Look East policy, while my colleagues in the rest of the panel will look at the military and security aspects. So that's how we kind of divided the panel. So let me start first with why I decided to take a look at this. It's because a lot of the press, a lot of the analyses that we get from the West normally sees Russia and Iran as in cahoots, right? Axis of the sanctioned, the new axis of evil, etc. Oh, they are both in BRICS and they are in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So a lot of the analyses tends to link them together as in they have very aligned interests. So I've tried to look at it here in this paper by trying to assess whether they really have aligned interests, particularly in the economic sphere. So I'm going to divide this discussion into three different economic aspects, commodities. We're going to look at the North-South transport corridor and take a quick look at the economic aspects of relations with Central Asia and the Caucasus. So before 2022 February, around more than 50% of Russian oil traditionally went to the West, went to Europe. About 1/3 of it went to Asia. So don't be mistaken, Russia was already in Asia even before the February events of last year. Today, however, because of the sanctions, etc., 80% of Russian oil, as opposed to 30%, now goes to Asia, particularly to China and to India. So you would expect that Russia could be taking Iran's share, particularly in the Chinese market, which is the world's largest import market for oil. And here is a very helpful chart to take a look at that. Now, although this chart doesn't show Iran, you may ask me where Iran is in this chart. Well, I wasn't clever enough to superimpose my own information on Iran oil on this. But basically, Iran oil in China is roughly around 0.5 million barrels on this scale. And then after 22, it goes up, and today it's about 1.6 million barrels per day in the Chinese market. Okay, but as you can see, Russian oil has a much higher market share there. So the question is Russia actually being a spoiler in terms of Iran's Lookie's policy with China? And is Russia taking up market share? The quick answer is no. Right? It's not taking up Iranian market share, Iranian by volume. Right? Iranian volume has increased since 2022, and that's because the Chinese demand as a whole has grown substantially, as you can see from the blue boxes, the blue bars behind on the left-hand scale. So China's been importing more oil from all players, and hence there is more room for both Russia and Iran. Why is China doing this? It's trying to stock up on its strategic stocks because oil prices are relatively low in anticipation of higher prices in future. Okay, so Russia is not being a spoiler in volumetric terms, but it is being a spoiler for Iran in terms of the revenue that Iran could potentially earn. Since Russian oil is sold at a discount, Iranian oil has to compete by being sold at more of a discount to Russian oil. And so in volumetric terms, in revenue terms, Russia is putting pressure on what Iran could have earned in the Chinese oil market. Russia is also putting pressure on Iran in terms of the number of oil tankers that are available who want to trade and transport in sanctioned oil. Okay, so I'm introducing this nuance because I think it's important to understand that Russia it should not always be seen as a spoiler. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, depending on what we are talking about. Let's move on to gas, right? Iran and Russia have signed cooperation agreements. Russia wants to help Iran improve its oil fields, gas fields, etc., in anticipation of developing Iran's oil and gas potential. Now, in particular for Russia, because of these ongoing events, Russia's strategy now has changed from exporting pipeline gas to exporting LNG gas, because LNG gas is not actually being sanctioned in Europe, only pipeline gas. So what happens is this is a key area that Russia is focusing on now. It wants to expand its export of LNG gas to the world. So is it actually helping Iran in terms of Iran's Look East policy? Because Iran could want to develop its own gas fields as well. And again, LNG is a more flexible option. Is Russia a spoiler? Is it a facilitator? Well, I would argue that it is actually in Russia's interest not to actually help Iran develop its LNG facilities. First, Russia doesn't really have the technical capabilities because of financial sanctions, etc. It doesn't really have the technical capabilities. It does have its own indigenous LNG technology, but this has only been tried so far on very small scale and not the kind of larger scale LNG facilities that Russia and Iran would like to develop. So it's limited technically, financially, and of course, Russia has little incentive to help develop Iran's LNG because it doesn't need extra LNG volumes on the market, particularly once Qatar releases its own expanded volumes, which will push down prices and make LNG development hugely unprofitable. Okay, so it's actually Russia in this case in gas is actually directly countering Iran's ambitions to sell more hydrocarbons to the east. I'd like to take a look at another commodity, which is steel. And here is quite an interesting case of, again, asking, do they compete or can they cooperate in this area in terms of the eastern markets? Now, Iran is among the top 10 steel producers in the world. Russia is a big export source to Europe before the war. Around 12% of the EU's imported steel came from Russia. Now, because of the EU sanctions on Russian finished steel, quite a lot of some Russian steel has been making its way to the Asian markets, where Iran has traditionally sold its steel to Thailand, to South Korea, to UAE, to China, etc. And indeed, Iranian steel producers have accused Russia of not only forcing them to take lower prices because of the discounts, but also then tanking Iranian production of steel, and hence it's not good for Iran. But again, I think this claim has to be taken a bit of salt, with a grain of salt. It's not completely Russia's fault that Iranian steel production is facing difficulties. Part of the reason why Iranian steel is facing difficulties is because of the slowdown in one of its larger customers, China, who is, the economy is not growing as fast, there's not as much demand for construction projects, hence there's not enough demand for steel. So you can't really blame Russia's, discounted steel for all of Iran's problems. But I also think that one really interesting aspect is that Russian steel is still making its way to Europe, because not all Russian steel is banned, only finished steel. So half finished steel, we call it semi-steel products, are still making its way to there with a 2-year transition period. Right? The European Union has said within 2 years, we won't even let in semi-finished Russian steel. Right? So in that sense, Russian policy is actually being sort of like driven by a response to European policy. It's not Russia that's really making the competition against Iranian steel, but there is this transition period where for the next 2 years, perhaps not as much Russian steel will find its way into Asia because it's still being sold in Europe. But who knows after the 2-year transition period is over? Just like who knows after China fills up its oil storage levels, Russia could then compete more intensively in volumetric terms with Iranian oil. The second aspect I want to look at is transportation routes. And for this, I will just cover it very briefly because I think it's going to be covered in another panel tomorrow when there's a panel on trade and sanctions. All I want to say here is that transportation routes, particularly the north-south corridor that you see in the picture in red, which is shorter than the existing trade route, which is about 40% shorter. The red one is 40% shorter, and therefore you save about 30% of the shipping costs. Right? Both Iran and China have aligned interests here. This is probably the clearest case of aligned interests in economic terms to develop what they call sanctions-proof trade route. So I think this is one area where there is clear alignment. Of course, there are problems in terms of financing, customs, etc. But I think this is one area where they can work together, and so Russia is actually facilitating the Iran's look east policy. Finally, I want to look at the case of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Iran here is trying to increase its influence through all kinds of means, political, diplomatic, cultural, etc., military, but of course economic means as well. And in this case, it's about gas swaps, right? Iran allows itself to buy gas from Turkmenistan, which then sells it to Iran, and Iran sells a similar quantity to Azerbaijan because there isn't a connector between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, right? So this is one of the ways it tries to increase its influence in Central Asia. At the same time, however, Russia is also promoting its so-called gas union with some of the Central Asian states. So Russia has started selling gas as well to Azerbaijan. And this allows Azerbaijan to then sell its own gas to Europe, right? So the question here again is Russia going to act as a spoiler in terms of Iran's gas sales to Central Asia? And for me, I don't think so, because the amount of Russian gas that is sent to Uzbekistan or to Azerbaijan is not really that huge to compete with the Iranian gas at the moment, right? And there are problems as well with the gas that's exchanged between Russia and Azerbaijan. The pipelines are old, the gas lines are old, there is aging infrastructure, etc. If we take a quick look at a final aspect, which is the Eurasian Economic Union, Iran wants to sign a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union 5 countries, including some Central Asian and Caucasian states. This, in theory, would help increase Iranian trade, Iranian influence over the region, particularly in terms of agriculture products. But again, here I don't see a lot of impact because at the moment trade is around 4.5 billion between Russia and Iran. Okay? That's not really a lot, considering that there's been a preferential trade agreement between the EA-EU and Iran for about 3 years. 4.5 billion is not a lot when we consider that Iran-China trade is about 4 times that. Okay, so this doesn't seem, this union, this free trade agreement doesn't seem to have made that much of an impact in increasing Iranian economic influence over Central Asia. So my conclusion then from this quick survey is that I find that there are mutual interests between Iran and Russia in terms of their own look at its policies. The interests coincide most in the North-South corridor. They compete most in terms of commodities, whether it's oil, gas, or steel. And with regards to their interaction in Central Asia, it's kind of neutral, right? Not much impact either way as a spoiler or as a facilitator. But a final point I would like to make is that not all of Russia's engagements with Iran are deliberate kind of policies that it actually strategizes on. Part of that is actually a reaction to European policies, right? So whether Europe, sanctions semi-finished Russian steel products, whether Europe wants to buy gas from Azerbaijan and therefore Azerbaijan needs gas from Russia, that is not really a deliberate Russian policy to act as a spoiler with regards to Iran in the region, right? It's sometimes just a reaction to policies by third parties. So if I want to link it to what the first speaker talked about this morning, it's not just about bilateral Iranian-Russian things, but we need to look at the wider multilateral and multiple bilateral relations when we want to do a full analysis. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Li-Chen, for perfect timing and a perfect start of the panel. So I have the pleasure to give floor to our second presenter, Dr. Abdolrasool, who will be speaking on the military dimension of Russian-Iranian relations. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nikolay. Well, if you let me, I would like first to start by thanking the Arab Center for organizing this wonderful event, and I also would like to thank Professor Mehran Kamrava for wonderful organization of the event. The third year, each year better than the previous year, and successful in terms of also production of outcome of the conference. Saying that, my discussion will will be focused on the strategic dimension of Russia-Iran relation in the military terms, and the question is, how this security military dimension of the relation will broadly impact the whole relation. Let me start by saying that when the first year of this conference was taking place, it was a kind of a research about institution, the role of the institution in Islamic Republic and decision-making cycle, the role of institutions in this issue. Where I contributed a paper arguing that decision-making in Iran foreign policy matters or changes subject by subjects. There are some areas that there are some actors active, and Russia is one of those areas that the number or the group of actors who are at the core of a decision-making cycle are not the ones who are in other areas or subjects. And who are there? The deep state, which basically means the IRGC, the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Intelligence, and to some extent, maybe even the greater level of extent, the General Staff of the Armed Forces. So I think it would be not so much precise understanding or trying to understand Russia-Iran relations without taking a deeper look at how these group of actors in the decision-making cycle of Iran function and work together and see Russia in general. Basically, their perception is at the core of a Russia-Iran relation. And then I will try to show that how this group or this elite group perception of Russia in broader term will contribute to understanding of Iran's look to the East policy. When usually talking about Russia-Iran relation in the military terms, there are lots of, in the public space, there are lots of memories of the mistrust or lack of trust to Russian systems, military systems, their delays and many criticisms that are usually publicized in the Iranian media and obviously also in the West. Just give you some examples. For example, many talk about the Russians are not reliable because they delivered S-300 with lots of delays. Russians are not trustable because when they delivered MiG-29s in the 90s, that was not the version that the Iranians were looking for. It was an analog version. Or they're not trusted because when they delivered the Kilo submarines, there were lots of problems in the maintenance of the issue. The Iranians didn't have the manuals. Or criticisms that sometimes comes to public regarding Russian, deliberate, obviously, disclosure of part of their secret activities with Iranians, like the Hamadan case airport, which was used by Russian for their operations in Syria. But my argument is that I think that's not precisely a very accurate way of looking how Iranian military security complexes view Russia. Particularly because of the four main reasons or four narratives that I, in the paper, tried to distinguish or trying to elaborate when it's about Iran's understanding of Russia, Iranian military understanding of Russia. First, is Russia as a, let's say, arms supplier. Look, if you look at Iran's Islamic Republic's history from early 90s, Russia remains constantly to be the only international actor, major global actor that provides Iran with advanced weapon systems. That process enormously contributed to fill the gap of Iran's conventional forces. Basically, without Russian delivery, there were some important conventional gaps in Iran's military capabilities. The first round is between 1990s and 2000, which Iran came out of the Iran-Iraq war. During the Hashemi Rafsanjani presidency, which the delivery of Russian weapons were critically important to address the conventional gap for Iranians. At that time, there were MiG-29s, Kilo submarines, hundreds of tanks, many anti-tank missiles which refurbished Iran's ground forces capabilities. But at the same time, I quoted in my research some interviews I'd done with former Iranian pilots and former commanders of Iran's Kilo submarines, the first commander of Iran Kilo submarines. The Iranian pilots who were actually the F-14 pilots who then went to Moscow to be trained for the MiG-29s. And the bottom line is that the Iranian technical operators of these weapon systems, despite the criticisms, were satisfied with the capability that these weapon systems provided to Iranian military. That brought later into the conclusion of Iran's general staff that working with Russia will be adding important factor to Iran's military capability. So the second phase, even interestingly, which basically starts by the Putin's era from 2000 until at least 2015 and 16, let's say before beginning of up to the beginning years of the JCPOA signature, is marked by the very interesting fact that Russia delivered sort of weapon systems that were very much important for Iran's deterrence after the Iraq-Afghanistan war in order to counter the American way of war, which were SAM systems, air defense systems, monitoring and reconnaissance capabilities. All the Russian deliveries during the early 2000 to 2015 are focused on SAM systems, Tor and One systems, IGLA systems, many important radar capabilities and electronic warfare capabilities that heavily contributed to Iran's capability to deter possible U.S. airstrike. And the third phase basically started from 2022, which basically we are at this stage now, is again important because of the role that probably will play in bringing or giving a capability to Iran that never had, and that is a modern, or at least never had the chance to modernize it, and that's its Air Force. We just saw the delivery of Yak 130s and probably the Su-35s. So one very important and big perception is Russia as an arms supplier. The second perception or narrative is Russia as a technological provider to Iran. Russia's contribution to Iran's military is not just arms and just not end products. It's actually providing to Iran access of certain technologies that without them, important segments of Iran's deterrence capabilities, among them the missile forces, among them Iran's passive defense capability, a space program, and nuclear capability, was not going to be in the situation that it is today. One of the very early cases of this issue is the missile program, which is largely well documented. I also in my paper try to touch on some less discussed issues of missile proliferation to Iran from the 90s, which basically I think to other cases also, passive defense, a space program and others, at least takes in three forms. Part of them are providing the trainings by Russians. Russians were the first who trained important Iranian scientists from Ministry of Defense in the 90s to how upgrade guidance systems, to design of the missiles, to provision of material capability, material engineering. So basically, Iranian students from Ministry of Defense and other IRGC sectors were present in important centers in Moscow to learn these technologies. So part of it is training. An important part of it is the transfer of the know-how, which is beyond training. Basically, that means provision of design, provision of the project management. For example, imagine that Iranians, when the early age of their missile program, when they wanted to start the program, they did not have the knowledge or capability of managing large multi-scale projects. They were given the access by Russians to see part of the important facilities, which were secret facilities during the 1990s and later in 2000. Which heavily contributed to Iran's understanding of how it needs to manage that whole process of its missile program or like its space program. And then it's the component, which again is end product component, not end product, but components like the guidance system, like the fuselage, like important materials that Iran was not able to produce. So this three-dimensional contribution heavily importantly impacted Iran's capability to forge part of its critical deterrence capabilities. As I said, missile defense is one example. Another example is the space program. You just heard the agreements between Iran and Russia last year that Russia will provide Iran with the capability to send the satellites over 350 kilograms, help Iran for its human space program and launch assistance on other type of satellites. The third narrative inside the Iranian military is Russia as a doctrinal source. Well, Russia, along with the United States, like it or not like it from the Western perspective, is a major military power. It's a source of many areas which are not technological, which are not armamental in nature. There are trainings, there are force preparation, there are readiness procedures, there are concepts of the design of plannings of the military operation. And Iran gained a lot of knowledge through this process. Organization designs, just give you several examples. For example, from the very early revolution, the concept of having an ideological political directorate in IRGC and then Artesh was something that adopted from Soviet time military strategies. Or, for example, IRGC's force restructure in 2008 was heavily influenced by Russian modernization program, military program that was given at some point some data during the early years of the Putin to Iran. So you have lots of these sorts of examples that provide Russia as a source of inspiration, as a source of military studies, which is different from the U.S. case because Iranians doesn't have a U.S. to military bases. Iranians doesn't have a U.S. to see the U.S. military trainings, but they have access to some certain critical assets in Russia. One case, and a big case, is Iran's passive defense program. It's something less discussed, but heavily influenced by Russia. You heard probably a lot about Iran's underground missile capabilities, which is basically comes out of the largest studies IRGC did in early 2000 after visiting some points in Russia. So And the last point is, as the last big narrative, is Russia as a supporter of Iran's military strategy. Probably Russia is the only major international actor that supports or have no problem with Iran's military strategy, which are the components of Iran's military strategy to very simplistically talk about it in these few minutes. Missile program, Iran's maritime strategy in the Persian Gulf, Iran's non-practice. Russia has no problem with none of these three main actors. As I said, even contributed to some of them, like the missile, like the missile program. But even Russia benefits from part of Iran's deterrence capabilities, like what Iran does in the Persian Gulf in limiting or reducing the maneuverability of the U.S. assets in the region is something that Russia interests politically, so it supports it. Or Iran's non-state actors, or what it calls axis of resistance, it's something that Russians have largely gained from, putting aside tactical differences that they had in Syria over some issues like the army restructuring of Syrian army or other things. But the Russian advancements in Syria, their cooperation with Iran was largely based on acceptance of Iran's let's say, Quds forces, a non-state actor model of intervention. Russia, I've written extensively on that. Russia cooperated with Iran, or at least tried to coordinate it itself with Iran's model of intervention in the Syria. And that has another reason also, which is important, and that is the very big and huge and multi-format, multi-level military-to-military dialogue between the two sides. They have multi-format. Why? Because there are lots of commissions. Iran has a military commission with Russia. So at the high level of the General Staff and Ministry of Defense, they regularly meet, at least yearly basis, several times. Then they have at the level of commanders. Then they have a level of below commanders at the operational level. So there are various levels. And there are multi-formats, not just at the bilateral level, but also at the multi-level formats, which are like the Shanghai Cooperation and others. So what I want to say by going so detailed into saying that how this relation is, first of all, beyond what we are seeing in Ukraine. This is not just a relation that has been formed around the Ukraine issue or the drones case. That's a very structured relation. It's a very deep relation, a multi-layered, multi-format based on a strategic perspective. Second, it's the fact that Iran's East, this case basically shows that Iran's East, look to the East policy is not a homogeneous policy. It is deep at some points. I'm ending, last point. It is deep at some points, like Russia-Iran case. In its military, it is very strategic, but as my colleague said, on the economy, it's not. So the same case exists between Iran and other Eastern countries like South Korea, that Iran has not a very good relation. And last point, and my end of the discussion, is that Iran's cooperation with, Iran's motive to move to the East is very much largely influenced by security and deterrence concepts. That's something that very much relates to how Iran defines itself in its relation with the United States, and the case of Russia is very much shown of that. Apologies if I go over 2 minutes.
Thank you. That's totally fine. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation, though remembering what kind of quality political department is in Russian army, I think that copying it was a big mistake. But that's a different story. So our third speaker today, who should be online, is Eric Loeb, and the fourth speaker, Mazaher Koruzhde. Let me give floor to them. They will be speaking about on the topic of risk-seeking Iran, explaining Iran's military support for Russia in the Ukraine war. Gentlemen, 15 minutes are yours, so please divide them between yourself accordingly. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll keep our comments brief. Again, I'd like to thank the Dr. Kamrava and the organizers of this conference. Regrettably, we can't be there. We wish we could, but anyway, we're happy to be a part of it. And I think this presentation piggybacks nicely off of the previous one in terms of explaining that this our central question to explain why Iran is transferring drones to Russia and other forms of military aid in Ukraine is part of a larger strategic context, particularly in the realm of security. Let me just make sure I can switch slides. So again, our main research question is why these drones and why this aid to Russia in Ukraine. And as my colleague Mazaher Koruzhde will get into, our main theoretical framework is embedded within prospect theory and Iran's perceptions of the domain of loss, particularly vis-a-vis the West, in three areas of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which obviously occurred with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and culminated with the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA and the reimposition of sanctions against Iran, the internal pressures of the popular protests culminating most recently in the Woman Life Freedom movement that we've seen beginning in mid-September of 2022, and then also the regional pressure of Iran feeling that it's coming up against a regional alliance between Israel and some of the Arab states in the Gulf and even beyond within the framework and context of the Abraham Accords that began in 2020 and continue as we speak. So in terms of my section of the paper, I look at beyond prospect theory. I look at alternative explanations that can explain these arms transfers. And of course, in the previous presentation, we talked about Russia delivering arms and other security to Iran. Here, obviously, the relationship has been inverted. And so I'll get into some of the alternative explanations for these transfers, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague who will delve more deeply into the theory and the mechanics and details of the argument. So one of the alternative explanations, and something that I've published recently in an edited volume on the Middle East arms race, is that we could see these transfers as part of a broader arms race in the region, revolving around drone technology and other forms of technology. We see particularly prominently, of course, alongside Israel, not just Iran, but also Turkey and the United Arab Emirates through China, and the Winglong 2 drone is delivering more and more drones to state actors in Syria, in Libya, between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh and others, and of course, more recently with Ethiopia during the Tigray War between 2020 and 2022. And all of these actors, of course, have ambitions, as do broader major powers in the international system, to use this technology to project power, to earn profits, to showcase their technology, to enhance their prestige, to influence conflicts and to strengthen alliances. And of course, this is part of an effort that Iran is using to strengthen its alliance with Russia. The first presentation talked about the economics aspects of that cooperation. And the second presentation on our panel talked more about the security and military related. And obviously, a lot of that centering around the question of Russian provision of fighter jets to Iran to modernize its conventional air force. Other alternative explanations would be historical inertia or path dependency. Outside of the history surrounding the strategic relationship between Iran and Russia, Iran itself has a history of its drone program. This program did not just emerge with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, but actually began during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, as well as during the Afghan War, the Civil War in the 1990s, where Iran had developed rudimentary models and designs of drones to be used for reconnaissance and to a lesser extent for combat purposes. So again, we could say that this, and then moving forward, Iran would use this technology for counterinsurgency operations inside its border and the region, particularly surrounding or neighboring countries. It also used it to surveil U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf. And then more and more, getting into the second point of political opportunity structures, when the UN arms embargo was lifted against Iran in October of 2020, this opened up a pathway for Iran more and more to export alongside Turkey, the UAE, Israel, and other regional actors, not to mention international ones, the technology to state actors inside and outside the region. So again, the case of Ethiopia is one example during the Tigray War, as well as to Venezuela, which it had been doing as well before the arms embargo went in place against Iran, or while it was in place, excuse me, before it was lifted. So the historical inertia and the political opportunity structures, particularly surrounding the lifting of the UN arms embargo, which could be even further lifted, certain provisions of it in the fall as we speak of this year, could open up more pathways for Iran to export drones, missiles, and other technology to state actors. The third point is, as we're discussing throughout this conference, Iran's eastward policy, which has tensions between its foundational doctrine of neither east nor west, where Iran always wanted to forge a middle path, if it could do so realistically between the two. Here we see it more gravitating more closely to China and Russia, and this is the outcome, the byproduct of Western pressures against Iran, and really the closing of channels to constructively engage the West. As I said earlier, with the maximum pressure campaign, and really pushing Iran more into the sphere of influence of Eastern powers. A fourth point is security alliances, or in the case of Iran, lack thereof, whereas countries like Turkey, which is part of NATO, of course, the UAE, which is not a NATO ally, but of course is looking to balance its relationships or relations between the United States, Russia, and China. Iran doesn't have those constraints, and particularly after the maximum pressure campaign, really became a natural ally or supplier as a result of those reduced constraints related to alliances, where it could supply drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. A fifth point is, and final point really, is that, of course, Iran is not supplying these drones to Russia in a vacuum, nor is Russia accepting them in a vacuum or deploying them in a vacuum, but using them within the context of the conflict dynamics as they evolve within the theater of the Ukraine conflict. So we see that Iran is supplying drones to Russia which has limited, surprisingly, combat and attack drone capabilities versus reconnaissance drones, accepting them and deploying them as the conflict evolved in the Ukraine. So, for example, when Ukraine received drones and other technology from the United States, the UK, Turkey, Poland, and other countries, of course, this incentivized Russia to do the same from Iran. And as the Ukrainians launched counteroffensive against Russia and made territorial gains against Russia, particularly in the south and the east, and for example, when the Crimea bridge was blown up about a year ago, you see that the Russians are more incentivized to deploy Iranian drones within the conflict, or within the theater of conflict in Ukraine. So anyway, these are some of the alternative explanations that we outline in the paper, to show that we're thinking of them, that we're not necessarily discounting them, and that there may be even a case of overdetermination, where you may even have too many factors and variables to account for these transfers. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, who will delve more deeply into the theory that we've developed and the main argument to explain these transfers.
I'm sorry, 5 minutes, please.
Hi, thank you so much, Eric. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me join my colleagues by thanking Dr. Mehran Kamraba and the organizers of the event. Can I share my screen? All right. So I don't have that much time. I have just 5 minutes to explain. The only thing that I can do in these 5 minutes is to explain how we have to have this new perspective from which we can see this entire Iran's eastward look and Iran's cooperation with Russia in terms of military and possibly economics. So the point that we are making in this paper is that this link between Russia and Iran, this cooperation, this military cooperation, is not and should not be seen across the board as something that does not vary. So this cooperation varies in terms of the context in which that cooperation is happening. For example, in this case that we are focusing on, Iran's military support of Ukraine, the context is that there is a war of Russia against Ukraine that West is supporting. So the military connection, military link between Iran and Russia in this context is different. It has more implications, and that's why we call it a risky behavior. So Iran's military support of Russia is a risky behavior because it involves the West, especially the United States, and that can lead to more sanctions, and even in the worst case scenario, it could lead to US and Israeli attack against Iran. What we do in this paper is to locate Iran's military support of Russia in a larger context of other Iran's risky behavior that has been ramping up since 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. You see in the slide, the higher uranium enrichment after 1 year of strategic or heroic patience, drone and missile and tanker attacks, hostage taking, military supply of Houthis against Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and military aid to Russia as a culmination of these risky behaviors. So we are putting military support of Russia in this larger context. The question that we are asking is that how can we better understand the nature of this strategic behavior? Our answer is we can understand it better through prospect theory perspective. Very, very short. Prospect theory posits that the value of an outcome for an actor, for a state, is nothing absolute, and it depends on the framing in which the actors think or perceive they're operating. If they think they are operating in a domain of losses, which is based on a reference point, they will become risk-seeking. And if they perceive that they are operating in the domain of gains, they will become risk-averse. And that's what we are supposed to, Iran is right now. Iran is a risk-seeking behavior and has been since 2016, which has led Iran to a step even more forward in this realm and support Russia against Ukraine, even though it knows that the other side is being backed by the Western countries. So the main argument of our paper is that the confluence of three streams has led Iranian officials to view themselves operating in the domain of loss. So this domain of loss for Iranian leaders has been shaped by the maximum pressure campaign that started in 2015-16. Prospect of Arab-Israeli alliance and the frequency of domestic protests, which has had the most important, the most serious threat against the Iranian regime, because one of the most concerns of this regime is the survival. I don't think I have much time. So just by, we argue in this paper that by adopting this viewpoint, we can also not only explain Iran's eastward look, but we can also explain raising the cost of war for Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen, the West's unwillingness to support the recent so-called Iranian revolution, and Iran's bluntness in cracking down on the protesters. To make a long story short, by adopting prospect theory in viewing Iran's support of Russia, we can better understand this entire military alliance between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for perfect timing. So I have pleasure to open the Q&A floor. So please keep your questions short. We have barely 15 minutes. Can we start with Dr. Sajadpour, please? We'll collect several questions. So. Do you have another mic? Sorry, it's the end of the day. The equipment is also getting tired. The issue with the people online, that's the problem. Otherwise, why not?
Yeah, this one is working.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. I think there were interesting presentations. I have one broad question from the panel. Listening carefully to all of you, I think Ukrainian war is a turning point. But this turning point has made the East more important than the West in the calculus of Iranian strategic thinking. Is it true or not? I mean, my reading from your presentations, which were very detailed, I mean technical, but inference from what you said is the Ukrainian issue is a turning point. The second question, which is very technical for the final presenter, I think it was taken as granted that Iran is supplying drones to Russia without any reference to quantification, to timing, and this drone was equated with military alliances. I think these are really erroneous assumptions. Tell us how many drones, which time. And there is a very interesting article recently published by an Iranian who studied in Portugal, and I think right now writes for international sites. His name is Mohammad Islami, in a very interesting technical article on the quality of Iranian drones. He names them with their qualification and suggests that Iran has not provided to Russia the most sophisticated drones that it has. And it is in the middle, let's say, range of drones. And I think it really negates this totality of Iranian alliance with Russia and Ukraine. So I want especially the response of two last speakers on this question, and also Professor Divsallar, who knows these details much more. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman in the row ahead, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have just a quick question on Dr. Divsallar about the domestic aspects of Iran-Russia relations. As far as we know, there are many critical voices, critical perspective about, and as you mentioned, suspect about these relations. So could you please elaborate a little bit about how these relations influence domestic policy in Iran or in the future of the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Diana, lady in red.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the panel, for very comprehensive presentations. If I may, I would like to expand these hard power approaches, economic and military understanding of Russia and Iranian relations, or discussing soft power or diplomatic relations. And if I may, this question to Nikolay, please, because it's related with the Gulf view. So, what's the GCC factor on the Russia and Iranian relations? So on the one hand, we could see normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia might play more positive dynamics. For example, there were a lot of discussions about North and South corridor and include the Gulf countries as well. Just in recent, in May, I mean, the Kazakh summit, this was discussed in Russia. On the other hand, also Russian endorsement of the free island resulted some kind of speculations, especially in the Western media, that there are some a bit deterioration relation between Russia and Iran. So to what extent Russia will be able to balance relations between the GCC and Iran relations, and what are the future of Russia and GCC relations given the Western also factor? As we know, GCC tries to kind of balance these relations or following this hedging diplomacy. And sorry for these questions. How this fits in general for this idea of a look east policy, what we are discussing today. Thank you so much. Sorry for a lot of questions.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have 1001 night story time today, so we'll keep it brief, and I'll pass this question to Li-Chen Sim. Yes, please.
My question is for Li-Chen. Your conclusion is that for Iran, Moscow functions more as a challenger than facilitator. Then what about Saudi Arabia? Does Saudi Arabia act as a facilitator or challenger in Iran's look east policy? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me call this round over, so just for the sake of time, and let me return back to our presenters. If you don't mind, we could start in the reverse order from Eric and Mazaher. Are you still with us?
Yes, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I can address some of the points, and Mazaher as well.
But please be brief.
Yes, yes. Occupational hazard. My apologies. My apologies to Mazaher. I would just say, yes, Mohammed Islami is, I don't know if I froze here, if you could still hear me. Oh.
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes, he was one of the contributors to the regional arms race work, and he's an excellent scholar in this area. In terms of the quantification of Iranian drones to Russia, there's different estimates, and of course the models revolve around the Mazaher 6 and the Shahid drones, which are now being produced reportedly in Russia. Which we could discuss in terms of why that's a move that the Iranians and Russians have made. But it has certainly been a step up when you look at other transactions, drone transactions between Iran and other state actors. With Ethiopia, the reports is that it was 2 Mazaher 6 drones to Ethiopia compared to more drones from Turkey and the UAE and China. And so this is a step up for Iran in terms of quantitative exports, as well as, you know, symbolically from a standpoint of prestige. Whereas Ethiopia is you know, a middle power in Africa. This was in the context of a civil war that did not receive much media coverage. Obviously, Ukraine dominates the headlines. And could be really viewed as you know, alongside a major power of Russia, could be viewed as an anti-systemic conflict against the United States and the West. You know, with even one Iranian official boasting that this would increase, that they received, you know, over 20 calls from different countries that this could boost Iranian drone sales. In terms of why Iran has not, I agree that Iran has not sold or exported the most lethal drones or even missiles to Russia, is I think it's waiting to see what's going to happen with UN Resolution 2231. As I mentioned in the presentation, whether provisions are going to be, let's say, eliminated that would perhaps allow Iran moving forward to export more lethal drones and missiles to Russia. But that's an open question, given, again, the lack of perhaps reciprocity in terms of Russian fighter jets in other areas where perhaps there's a bit of disappointment in Tehran. I don't know if Mazaher, you want to add any points to what I said?
Just very quickly, we do agree with Dr. Sajjadpour. I had the privilege of being in University of Tehran while he was teaching. Just very quickly, we agree with you that this is not an alliance in a very huge sense of term. And we also think that that's a reaction to West pressure. That's why we put maximum pressure campaign, external pressure, and domestic protests. So the timing that I mentioned is that we should not see Iran's military support of Russia as a continuation of Iran's military strategy towards East, the alliance with Russia in general, but also we have to look at it in the context of being pressured from the West and being pressured from the inside by the protests. So that's a reaction, and we don't believe that there is a very fundamental, mutually military interest between Iran and Russia. And I didn't have enough time to explain, but the road ahead that we sort of outline in our paper is that Iran is doing this mostly because it wants to gain some concessions from the West. So the favorite outcome for Iran is to come towards West again, not to go East.
Thank you. Dr. Abdolrasool?
Yeah, just let me start with the first question of Dr. Sajjadpour. I think, well, look, Iran export of less sophisticated drone was a calculated measure. I mean, Iranians have this experience of a calculated move. What I mean by calculation means that they were expecting to pose a level of pain to European security system. They were not wanted to go in a full-scale crisis with Europe. So that's exactly was the logic of not sending missiles and high-end scale drone capabilities to Europe. As I said to you last night, Iran-Europe relation is a love affair relation. Europeans betrayed Iranians, so Iranians wanted to show a level of pain, and that level of pain should not get to the, over a threshold of certain thresholds. The second reason is the phased stage of Iran delivery. I think Iranians delivered that because they were waiting to see that what will the Russian deliver in a response. They're not going to deliver what they have in their final assets threshold at the very beginning. Second reason is the export control regime inside Iranian Ministry of Defense. You should consider that every country has its own export control regime. Iranians they had it with their regional proxies. Iran did not export its high-end products to regional proxies, even to Hezbollah. So we cannot expect that Iran provide some of its sophisticated drones to Russia. That's a sensitive technological issue. We have it in the West, we have it in Iran, everywhere. We have the export control regime internally for every country. And the last thing is the capability show. I think there was a big concern from Iranian side. They didn't want to send us sophisticated systems because they were feared of the possible American counteroffensive or counter preparation mechanisms. These are the assets that needs to be used in an actual warfare situation with United States or Israel. They're not going to show the capability. So these are the three operational reasons that I see that I read Iran's Ministry of Defense decision to not send high-end capabilities. About the issue of the GCC, I think, of course, you know better than me that the Russians have this strategic stability calculus in their mind when it comes to Persian Gulf region. And that's the reason that they're against Iran getting nuclear proliferation. But the question is that where that strategic stability point of threshold for Russia is. Russia for years has been rejecting sending sophisticated weapons that can change this strategic stability. My understanding is that S-235 or even S-400 will not probably, from Russian perspective, change its strategic stability because Saudi Arabia and UAE are receiving high-end technologies, new capabilities recently. They signed a contract, so probably Russians will see that as, again, sort of balance. So basically, from Russian perspective, again, you are not changing the whole principle of your proliferation system. Basically, you are not going against your own strategic stability calculus. That's a key point here. And about the last question on domestic aspect, well, I think yes. I mean, I have a new paper coming recently. articulated in a very clear way that Iran-Russia relation is a sort of a protective integration alliance. Basically, the two states have a desire to protect themselves from any regime change mechanism. That basically has one leg into the military side and one leg in the domestic capabilities. So that means that explains why, for example, Russia is providing intelligence to Iran and why the recent Russian-Iranian Cyber Information Security Pact, which was passed in the parliament just 1.5 years ago, is becoming activated just last year, and explains that why Russia provided Iran with reconnaissance or, let's say, surveillance capabilities for the city control and protest and so on. So what I'm saying is that what I argued in my paper is just only that military terms. With that military terms is a spectrum. It has a continuation that has a domestic file because both sides has a broader protective integration approach toward each other. Both have critical concern about regime stability and regime security. That's where both sides agree that should be the core of the relation.
Thank you. Li-Chen, 3 minutes, please.
Right, so for the first question, is the Ukrainian war a turning point and I'll answer it from Russia's perspective of Russia's engagement in the East, in Asia. Ukrainian war is not really a turning point for Russia in the East because Russia has made its pivot to the East before in the earlier part of the 2000s. But where it is, so is it a turning point? So I would see it as a series of punctuated equilibriums. There was sort of like a mild turning point, and then now there's even more of a turning point. Is it likely to be more sustainable this time around? I think so, because sanctions are very sticky. It's very hard to get out of. So in that respect, it's more of a chance that Russia will stay engaged with Asia this time around. Second question, Diana, on the GCC factor in Iran-Russia relations. Certainly, GCC's closeness to Russia makes it easier for Russia and Iran to, become buddies or axis or whatever you want to call it. I also think another factor is that the GCC has learned to compartmentalize the relations with Russia. So it accepts that in some cases, Russia is going to want to be closer to Iran for certain things, drones or, other stuff, islands it wants to give diplomatic support. But it has also been able to compartmentalize and see that Russia is able to support the GCC in terms of OPEC plus quota, staying within the OPEC plus membership, and that's really important to the Gulf states. So they've learned to compartmentalize their relationship and to give and take. Third question, no, I didn't actually say that Russia was a spoiler in terms of Iran's look east. I said it depended on the issue area, whether it was commodities, whether it was the north-south transport route or in Central Asia. So by the same token, whether Saudi Arabia is a spoiler or facilitator for Iran, again, depends on which issue area we're looking at and which time period. So initially, you could see Saudi Arabia as more of a spoiler, but recently with the so-called talking and rapprochement, it's become a little bit more of a facilitator. So time, really, the time period is important, and also the issue area. Like, are you talking about oil? Then in that case, KSA, Saudi Arabia has more of a financial clout to be a spoiler for Iran in China. So it really depends on issue areas.
Thank you. Before we call it a day, I was asked to give 30 seconds, sorry.
Yeah, just very, very shortly, because I just forgot to answer one question about the point of critical junctures or turning points Dr. Satrap would ask. I think Ukraine is not the only critical juncture or turning point for Iran-Russia relations. We had the Syria just a few years ago. That was probably very, very important. It was a point that a phenomenon took place between Iran and Russia relation. That was their military operational cooperation never had there in their history. Even before that, and you had it after the U.S. attack to Iraq. I mean, the cooperation that took place in the military terms between 2003 to 2005 and 6 are important, but less been discussed because basically that was a time that there's a calculus on the Russian side that the U.S. should be stopped from changing the regimes in the system of security system of the Persian Gulf, and that's where we have a new round of arms deal between Russia and Iran, which basically led to the S-300, Tor M1, and other important assets, which are usually, again, not that much publicized, but I think quite important. So I would say at least you had several critical junctures, and I think Ukrainian crisis is one of them only.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our presenters for very interesting panel, and I'm really sorry that I need to call today, but thank you very much. We learned a lot today. Thank you.